This is lesson 10.2, simplifying radicals. Now, a simplified radical, remember a radical expression is anything with the square root symbol or cubed root or anything like that. If it's simplified, it has no perfect square factors, so that means inside the radical, there's no perfect square. We know the perfect square of 16, or the square root of 16 is 4. So you can't have any factors of the number being a perfect square. For example, we also couldn't have the square root of 32, because 32 is the same thing as 16 times 2. So since 16 is a factor of 2, that would not be a simplified radical. There cannot be a fraction inside the radical, so you cannot have the square root of 2/3. That is not a simplified radical. And you also cannot have a radical in the denominator. Actually, let's do a different example. So that one wouldn't work. And also, even if the numerator didn't have one, you cannot have a radical in the denominator. So let's do some simplifying. What is the simplified form of the square root of 160? So the first thing is we want to break down our factors. What are the factors of 160? Well, there's 16 and 10. I know that 16 is a perfect square, so I'll leave it there. 10 goes down to 2 and 5. None of those break down, so I'm going to go ahead and call this the square root of 16 times 10. Which is the same thing as the square root of 16 times the square root of 10, which is the same thing as 4 times the square root of 10, and that is our simplified form. What is the simplified form of the square root of n to the 9th power? Now, what's important to know is that when you take the square root of n squared, that's just n. If you take the square root of n to the 4th power, that would be n squared, because n squared times n squared is n to the 4th power. So anytime we can break it down to the even root, half of it will be the square root. So n to the 9th is the same thing as n to the 8th times n, which we can break down to be the square root of n to the 8 times the square root of n, which would be n to the 4th power times the square root of n. Let's combine both of those things. What's the simplified form of square root of 54 n to the 7th? So first looking at 54, that breaks down into 9 times 6. 9 is a perfect square. 6 goes to 2 and 3. Neither of those are perfect squares. So we have 9 times 6 times, we want to break our n down into an even root, n to the 6th power times n. So that is the same thing as the square root of 9 times the square root of 6 times the square root of n to the 6 times the square root of n, which could be 3 times the square root of 6 times n to the 3rd times the square root of n, and then we'll bring them all together, our numbers out in front, times the square root of 3n. I am so sorry. I don't know why I turned that into a 3. This should be a 6 here and a 6 here. So our answer, 3n to the 3rd times the square root of 6n. And now we're going to do a little multiplication. When you have to multiply radicals, you'll multiply the numbers outside of the radical. So 2 times 3 is 6. And then inside the radical, you'll multiply those numbers. 14 times 7 is 8 to 98. T times t squared is t to the 3rd power. So we want to break those down into roots. 98, that is 49 times 2. And right away I notice 49 is a perfect square. So we have 6 times the square root of 49 times 2. We want to break our variable down into an even power, t squared times t. So that's 6 times the square root of 49 times the square root of 2 times the square root of t squared times the square root of t, which is 6 times 7 times the square root of 2 times t times the square root of t, which we can simplify down into 6 times 7 is 42t square root of 2t. The simplified form of a fraction or a rational radical expression is quite simple. You'll break it down to the square root of the top over the square root of the bottom. Square root of 64 is 8. Square root of 49 is 7. Now sometimes those fractions don't break down quite so beautifully. So you'll have the square root of 7 over the square root of 8n. Now remember, simplified form, we cannot have a radical in our denominator. So to cancel it out, remember, to undo a square when we had x squared, we would take the square root of it and it would cancel out. The opposite is also true. If we have the square root of x, we will square it, and that cancels it out. Remember, squaring is multiplying it by itself, so when we do that, it will cancel it out, and you will just have x left. So if we want to get rid of this square root here, we're going to multiply by the square root of 8n and the square root of 8n. When we do that, our radicals will cancel out, and we have the square root of 7 times 8 is 56n over 8n. Because again, remember that radical totally got canceled out. When we want to simplify the top, we never want to leave it like that. 56, that is 4 times 14. 4 is a perfect square. 14 is 2 and 7. So we have the square root of 4 times 14 times n over 8n, which is the square root of 4 times the square root of 14 times the square root of n over 8n, which would be 2 times the square root of 14n over 8n, and we need to see if we can reduce 8 and 2, which would be 1/4. So our answer is the square root of 14n over 4n, and that is our final answer. Well guys, I hope that video was helpful. I'll see you in class. And just as a word of encouragement, I just wanted to let you guys know, there once was a time in my life when I was addicted to the hokey pokey. But then I turned myself around.